of women were out of the workforce for a variety of reasons. And we really saw this reduction in women participating in the workforce overall. But in the last few months, we know that women's labor force participation has gone up substantially. Women have just rocketed back into the labor market, just even in the last 2 or 3 months. So this has been really significant. And I've put up this graph because usually when I'm doing these fireside chats, I'm talking about Canadian information. And so folks have asked me for some additional information about the US as well. So this is some information about women in the US labor market. It's pretty similar in different parts of the world as well, in countries like Canada and Australia, New Zealand, that this prime age, so 25 to 54, that participation has gone up and has gone up over time. We now have a record number of women in the labor market, higher than ever before, at least in Canada and the US. And you'll notice in my very messy highlighted lines, the bottom line are those prime age women in the workforce. And you can see that change in their labor market participation since 1960. Don't think that's overly surprising, given that, we've had a lot more women move into jobs since the 1960s. But I think the other interesting line is the blue line that I've highlighted at the top, and that's women in those 55 and over years. And you can see how dramatically their labor market participation has increased also. We know that this type of gender diversity at work is really important. It not only expands our leadership pipeline for women, but we also know that gender diverse teams do better, that companies that are more gender diverse tend to be more profitable. So we know that having more women at work is good for business overall. But women are facing some headwinds. Even though we've come back in these record numbers, we're still facing some really significant headwinds at work in terms of a few different things. And one of the things that this starts with is pay equity. So you can see from this graph, I think this is really interesting when we look at pay equity across the lifespan, looking at women at the beginning of their careers, very early in their careers, and that's 16 to 24 age group. There's a much smaller difference between men and women. It's about 8%. But as we look at women in those prime age years, those women that I was talking about coming back in such record numbers into the workforce, we're now looking at about 16% difference. And it becomes even more striking as women get older. We really take a loss in terms of the difference between that gap between men and women. And so 22% less as we get into the 55 to 64 and 27% less 65 and older. You might look at that graph and say, well, that's probably because women are taking, partial retirement or early retirement, but it's not the case. These numbers are looking at full-time workers. So we are experiencing some pretty significant differences in pay, and it is markedly different as we get older. And this isn't significant just because of pay. I mean, pay, of course, is really important, but also when we have this plateau in earnings as compared with men, women are put at a disadvantage in terms of things like saving, paying off mortgages, having less debt. And so when we look at that and the impact of other things that are going on for women, particularly in those prime working years, and then also 55 and older, there's really an impact from a number of different elements, things like caregiving as well. So women who are spending time caregiving and taking a loss in their wages are now at a bigger disadvantage. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. There's some other things going on as well. So it's not just pay equity. When we look at what's happening for women, again, at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of women were leaving workplaces and not returning. We just saw women leaving the workforce. Now we're seeing women shift between companies, having these shifts where they're looking for more from another company. And this is especially evident with female leaders. So female leaders still are leaving at an unprecedented rate. They're leaving their current companies and moving. And they're moving because of some of those other issues at work, like I mentioned, that go beyond pay. So this report from McKinsey and Lean In, there was a report done of about 40,000 employees, I think in about 10 countries around the world, including the US, Canada, Australia, and a few European countries as well. They found that women were leaving their jobs in these record numbers, or moving jobs in record numbers, for things that I think, get a lot of airtime, things like stress and burnout. But then for other things related specifically to gender, a lot of things around microaggressions in the workplace, or being in positions where maybe they were a bit underestimated in terms of their abilities, particularly in leadership. And so when we think about all of these women leaving and these women in leadership positions leading, just to put it in perspective for you, the number that McKinsey and Lean In identified in their report is that if we think about one woman moving into a directorship role, another two women typically are leaving from those same level positions. So we know that women are initiating these career transitions, but sometimes they're also leaving the sector and moving to entirely different sectors. And there was a poll done by LinkedIn in 2022 looking at this. Women tend to leave about 20% more often than men to move to different sectors. And again, those career transitions can be for a number of different reasons. As I mentioned, things like stress and burnout, microaggressions, but it's also to look for a better work culture, wanting better work-life balance, and sometimes just fleeing an unpleasant work situation. So looking at the reasons why men will leave their organizations, they're usually looking for things like career advancement or better pay, better financial opportunities, but women are leaving for things that maybe we wouldn't see as often on the surface. There's a lot of things going on in the background. So again, if we're thinking about this in terms of lifespan or across the career, I think these are some really interesting things to look at. And you'll notice on this slide that some of the factors that prompt current female leaders to leave, so things like not having enough flexibility, not having those opportunities to advance, maybe, as I mentioned, people underestimating their abilities in their leadership positions, not having manager support, organizational commitment to DEI is enormous, and also organizational commitment to well-being, really, really important. But if you look at the dark circles in this graph, these are the current women leaders. So we can assume that many of these women are probably in those prime age years or even in the 55 and older years. But if you look at the women under 30, so they're the light blue circles, you can see how important some of these issues are to them, that they're coming out more strongly than the current women leaders in terms of what sort of value they're placing on these different things. especially around opportunities to advance an organizational commitment to well-being, and that includes having a flexible workplace. And I think we need to take notice of this because, if we're losing female leaders, we also are at risk of losing our next generation of female leaders if we're not putting some of these things in place. Because those younger women, the women under 30, really they really place this high premium on having an equitable and supportive workplace. They're watching those senior women and they're watching them leave to sort of greener pastures. So I think this is where I would really want to talk about the importance of workplace well-being. And I say that because that piece around flexibility and opportunities, I think we can weave into workplace well-being as well. When I think about the age-friendly approach, and I won't go into the whole background of the age-friendly movement, but it started about 20 years ago, and I mentioned it started with city planning. And the idea originally was just helping people to be more active as they got older, but it was quickly evident this is not going to be all that we need in terms of keeping people healthy across the lifespan. And so the age-friendly movement has really changed to include these different dimensions that we look at. And it's really holistic, for lack of a better word, looking at different parts of well-being. And we can translate this to the workplace quite easily. When I think about having a more age-friendly workplace, I would probably start just with the physical space itself. Are we allowing, and if we're talking about women specifically, are we allowing women those physical spaces where they have opportunities to move throughout the day? We have a very sedentary lifestyle, as most people know, and women working in desk jobs typically are spending hours and hours and hours of seated time. We know this has a big impact on health and a big impact on our chronic disease risk. That would be number one, just helping change some of those physical environments to make them be what we would call more activity permissive. So allowing women to move more throughout the day and encouraging them to move more. This doesn't mean structured exercise, which would be great, but it just means opportunities to get up and move. What about other things in terms of our physical environment? Well, I would think about simple things, washrooms that includes feminine hygiene and hopefully feminine hygiene products that are free. That's just an acknowledgement that women are dealing with some of these issues behind the scenes that maybe we don't talk about very often, but this would be something that would be really supportive. Having fans available for women who are going through the menopausal transition and not making this really obvious, but just having them available. Just creating those physical environments that are more supportive. It doesn't require a huge cost, but it's not only the physical environment itself, but it's the statement that makes and the support that it provides. I would also think about organizational policies. So things like flexible schedules. I know we keep talking about this in remote work, but it's really important. And especially, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on, but especially across the lifespan and especially for women, having those flexible workplaces are really, really key. I would also recommend, in terms of that organizational policy, really looking at your policies around caregiver support. So caregiver support could extend from parental leave to caregiving for relatives, spouses. You might be surprised to know that there were a larger number of women out of the workforce during the COVID-19 pandemic, the height of it, who were caring for relatives. There were more of them caring for relatives than who were home caring for children. So that piece around caregiving is huge. And many of the women in those prime age years are in the sandwich generation, caring for both children and older relatives or spouses. We'd also want to look at organizational culture, so key. Do we have those healthy role models? Are other women seeing women who are able to advance, who are able to take care of their health at the same time, who are being supported in their well-being? And maybe that's having some sort of peer support program or having an employee resource group for women. Also having ongoing programs and structures in place that acknowledge some of these things that we think about that are going on behind the scenes that women are dealing with. So having maybe coaching or mentoring, having that employee assistance program be available and obvious. And then finally, maybe looking at employee buy-in. So do we know that these things are happening? We know from research. I could talk about different research papers that support some of this information, but do we know in our own workplaces? So the first place that we start is by asking. So maybe having a short survey or having a small focus group or one-on-one interviews with women to ask what are some things that they're looking for that they need in their workplace. Again, things don't have to be really expensive or onerous, but small changes can make a big difference. So I wanted to draw your attention to this slide because I think this is so interesting. I don't love the word wellness personally. I find it really hard to operationalize, but I think when we think about wellness, we can pretty safely say that we're all probably talking about some sort of aspect around health and how our health is supported. And I've put up this piece of information around productivity losses related to health problems, costing US employers about $225 billion every year. And if we look at where workplace wellness is on this spending chart, it's right down there with spas and thermal mineral springs. So less money is being spent in the workplace. But beyond just supporting employees, having good health and well-being programs is good for business and it's good for increasing productivity. So this isn't specifically about women, but just seeing this graph really made me pause. And I wanted to share this with you because I think it's so important. So how do we better understand some of these unique challenges for women, and how do we understand them across the life course, or maybe across the career span would be a better way to think about it? Because when we're talking about age-friendly, again, if I go back to the original spirit of the age-friendly movement, we've always talked about it in a more global sense, not in a workplace, but in a more global sense, is this idea of the 8 to 80. So if you make things better for people who are 80, you're probably going to make them better for people who are 8 as well. If we're making structures and policies better for people in terms of supporting them, we're going to support people across the lifespan. So if we think about that in the workplace and we just think about how do we support women across the career span, it's an interesting question. How do we make those structures better overall? And so in my nerdy way, of course, I went to the research to try to understand how is it that we can look at this better when we're talking about women across the career span. So one of the papers that I found, and there's a lot of work being done from Nordic countries around this area about women at work and women across the lifespan. But I also wanted to look at just information from the last 3 years, because I think so many things have changed for women, particularly since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, that I wanted to get research that really helped me to understand what's going on currently. And even now, we're not really up to speed because a lot of those projects are still being completed. But what I found, one paper that I thought was quite interesting was this women's health and working life scoping study from Norway. And it was just published this year. And they talked about this gender gap in sickness absence, which I thought was kind of interesting, that they found that women on average were more likely to have sickness absence. And it was pretty substantial when you looked at different statistics around women being off work sick. And so what the researchers did is they tried to break down some things that were unique for women as opposed to men. And because I think on the surface, we might say, well, maybe women have more sickness absence because they're caring for children, or because of, their work environment, or maybe even career choices. I mean, there's all sorts of things that we can think about why this happens. So the researchers broke this down into three different things. One was around the life stages of hormonal impacts. So things like menstrual problems, endometriosis for some women, and the whole menopausal transition. These are huge impacts that, again, we're not really having much of a conversation about, but women are having significant health issues. And I know that these are not illnesses, but they're things that sometimes can cause women to need to take time off work to manage. There's also pregnancy. And I know not all women go through pregnancy, but the researchers looked at this as one of the components. And you might be surprised to know that this was the biggest reason for that difference in sickness absence, was women just going through pregnancy, is that they were managing their pregnancy related illnesses through their sick leave. And so when you put that into the equation, we really leveled out that difference between men and women. And then the last piece was around complex and chronic health conditions that are a bit different for women. Women tend to have more chronic pain conditions, and they tend to suffer from headaches far more often than men. So this was something also that made a difference in terms of just across the lifespan, why women might take time off work. We also know that women are at a higher risk than men for depression, and that particularly in reproductive years, and again in that midlife menopausal transition time, where women go through something called the window of vulnerability, where they tend to have a higher vulnerability to develop depression for all sorts of reasons. But that's one more piece around that, how women might be impacted in terms of some of their health conditions at work. So when I looked at this again, I went back, and then after looking at that research, why some of the reasons why women might be away from work, or things that they might be struggling with, I thought this was really interesting, looking at some of the top performing companies and their policies around similar things that I just talked about. So having personal leave for mental health care, so people, are able to take care of their mental health. You'll notice that the top performing companies had better personal leave. They had support for miscarriage, backup for childcare services. And then going back to some of the things that I talked about earlier, they had this ability for caregivers to take time off and not be penalized when they came back into their roles. So coming back to a similar role. This is also important around caregiving for kids and the ability for parents to take time off. So again, a combination of things that were more supportive across the lifespan. This was another piece that I thought was really interesting when I was trying to understand, how do we contain this into, a short talk around age-friendly careers. When I started my career about 30 years ago, we talked then a lot about work-life balance. And I remember doing a project on work-life balance. But I think since that time, most of us understand that work-life balance is pretty hard to achieve. a balance. But I thought what was interesting is looking at this idea of work-life reconciliation. So how do we bring our work life and our outside of work life together in a way that works and is manageable? When we look at a life course perspective around this managing of work and non-work life, we can look at it, in a traditional way. I suppose that we'd look at some of the things that go on for women in terms of parenting, caregiving, but then there are also things for women who don't have kids or who are, not responsible for caregiving. They might have really a lot of time that is devoted to hobbies outside of work or to sports or to volunteering. There might be things that really demand a lot of their time that aren't related to those traditional things that we would think when we think about women outside of work. And so still recognizing, that we need that time for other things that are going on outside of work. It was interesting to look at a Finnish study, and they found that across the lifespan, women were doing better if they could have slightly shorter work days rather than having a flex day. A lot of women are in positions where they would have a flex day every 2 weeks. But what they found in this study was just shortening the workday slightly allowed for some of these other things that were going on outside of work and made that better work-life reconciliation and work-life balance. Again, though, to just go back to that idea of the caregiver piece, and I just wanted to, I guess, maybe reiterate this, if that work-life reconciliation, you can see the caregiver burden for women. And I would draw your attention to that middle line of the graph that's so big. Those are the women who are now coming back in those record numbers into the workplace. Also, the women who are in that movement between organizations. I think this is a piece that we sometimes miss in terms of support, is just making sure that women are acknowledged and supported for the amount of time and impact that caregiving piece really has on their life and on that work-life reconciliation. I also wanted to talk about this idea of gendered ageism. And I think many people think about gendered ageism as something that happens just for women as they get older. And there's some obvious things here that women are less likely to be called back for interviews. So women over the age of 40 are less likely to be called back for interviews. They're more likely to be passed up for promotions. They have more microaggressions at work. And so these things I think we talk about more often now, which is great. But gendered ageism also happens with women when they're younger. And so there's an interesting phenomenon that in North America, gendered ageism applies more often to women as they get older. But in Europe, more younger women are suffering from gendered ageism at work. And so that's that idea that you're not old enough, that you don't have enough experience, and how could you be doing this job given your age? There was a colleague that made a comment on my LinkedIn last week about this idea of no right age for women. And she compared it to being an avocado, that there's this sort of perfect time that's fleeting, that women are considered to be at a perfect age, and then they're either too young or too old. And I think most women would probably agree that this happens not only at work, but it happens in life in general. So definitely an issue that women are managing in the workplace. So when I think about this, the role of many of these things that are happening for women across their career span, their lifespan, those caregiving pieces, the gendered ageism, the issues with pay equity, the stress and burnout, the higher level of mental health issues, and especially around depression, I think we have a need for more tailored support. And when I think about this, just generally, when I'm thinking about an age-friendly workplace, and I talked earlier about, some of those structures that we could put into place and some of the policies maybe we could think about, there's also just some practical steps that we can take. So the first one that I would suggest is just knowing your numbers. Do you understand the age diversity in your workplace currently? Do you know the number of women in different age groups, and maybe looking at some of the hiring practices around that as well? I would also suggest auditing policies and practices. So are you supporting that age inclusive kind of environment? And especially in DEI, very few DEI programs include age as part of the conversation. I would also suggest revisiting or looking at those flexible work policies, and ones that are non-punitive. So one of the things that women have reported on, especially during the later part of the COVID-19 pandemic, is this idea that sometimes if they're in flexible work arrangements or in remote work arrangements for whatever reason, that they feel like that there's maybe a little bit of a price that they pay for being there. So making sure that women understand, if they have that flexible work arrangement or that remote work arrangement, that they're still going to be part of the organization. There's still going to be available opportunities for them for advancement. I also would revisit your health and well-being programs and make sure that they're really age inclusive. And what I mean by that is, maybe in those earlier career or even in the prime working age years, having things like parental support, maternity support programs, but then also later in the career, having things like menopausal transition support, and having that, it could be part of that employee resource group, having just some information for those different changes for women. We can also think about really practical things like bone health for women as they get older. Are we thinking about that just even in fitness programs and making sure that our fitness programs are safe for everyone? We also want to think about that lifelong learning and skill development. So important. Making sure that older workers especially are able to upgrade skills and knowledge. And then looking at, and I mentioned this just a moment ago and earlier, looking at your hiring practices. So making sure that you're really looking carefully at age bias in job posting language, and then also in interviewing. Sometimes the language can creep in around having a young workforce. And I think that's really important to make sure that that language is age inclusive. So here's some specifics just around different career times for women. When we think about age-friendly strategies for early career, and we think about that, the chart that I put up earlier about young women really caring about having opportunities for advancement, that number is about 2/3 of women under 30 who really want to be senior leaders. And again, I mentioned earlier this idea that women in this age group are really concerned about DEI, about well-being, and having flexible workplaces, also having good support from their managers. So I would recommend just some simple things. One would be a mentorship program, and especially for women of color. This is really important in terms of advancement, pay equity, all of those things as well that impact women differently in that intersection of race, gender, and age. We'd also want to make sure that we're thinking about that age bias around women being capable enough in promotions based on age, and really working to reduce something called lookism. And lookism's interesting. It's thinking about how much the impact of a woman's looks has plays in terms of her role at work. And I think, this is something that is still happening, of course, at work, where women of a certain age are judged based on, maybe the way that they dress or the way that they're caring for their appearance at work. And this can be right across the age span, but it does affect young women pretty substantially as well. Then we want to think about age-friendly strategies for mid-career. And, let's face it, we have a really significantly aging population across the world. And there's exceptions. There are some countries that aren't aging in the same way. But if we think about countries like the US and Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all of these countries have a significantly aging population. In the US, the median population age right now is 38 and a half years old. This is, of course, the highest that it's been. And it's very similar in Australia and New Zealand. I think Australia is 38 and New Zealand is 38 and a half. I might have those backwards, but it's all around about the same age. In Canada, we have an even more rapidly aging population. Our average age is almost 42 years old, so pretty significant. So we know that because we have this big group in that aging population, the mid-career strategies are really important. I go back to that idea of caregiving responsibilities and having the opportunity to choose those work arrangements. I think it's really important, especially for women in these prime age years or these more midlife years, to have remote work options. And also making sure that we have those childcare options as well. Again, looking at well-being programs that are across the lifespan is really important. But when we're looking at this age group, we'd want to really focus on chronic disease prevention. It's a sad fact that cardiovascular disease is still the biggest killer of women worldwide. And women are still less likely to get support when they are having a heart attack. They're less likely to go to cardiac rehab. There's all sorts of things around heart disease that we're missing for women, and especially women as they move into midlife and older. So we really want to focus on that chronic disease prevention piece. And that's across the board. Of course, that's not only cardiovascular disease, but cancer, diabetes as well. And so making sure that we have those chronic disease prevention programs in place, and also thinking about programs for chronic stress, burnout, and for mental health care, really important. Then when we think about women in their later career, women 55 plus, I showed you that line of the number of women over the age of 55 who are in the workforce now. This is our biggest demographic in Canada right now. When we look at age bands from Statistics Canada, women in the 55 age group are our biggest group. And one of the projections is that by 2026, women over the age of 55 will constitute 1/3 of all of our new hires. So we have this resource that's available. When we think traditionally about the pipeline of younger workers coming in, and older workers retiring, that's not really a reality anymore, because we have far less of those younger workers coming in, but we have more people who are staying in the workforce longer. And in fact, in Canada, if we typically think about a work span of being, maybe 16 to 65, we know now that there's about 20% of folks who are over the age of 65 are still working. So it's not that people are just going through this work span and then retiring. Many of them are staying in the workforce. And so not all folks are planning to retire. Again, this is an important pipeline that we don't want to miss. But we also know that when we go back to that gendered ageism piece, that women in this group, and especially jobless women, are far less likely to find work, far less likely to be called back for interviews. And so we want to think about this again in terms of hiring practices. I think that's really important. Going through and making sure that those hiring practices are open to people who are over the age of 55. Also providing flexible work. Again, I know I keep coming back to that, but flexible work's important to women at different stages in their career for different reasons. And so for a lot of women 55 plus, they're looking for more flexible work or even part-time work to pursue other things as well. We also want those age-specific pieces in our well-being program. So again, support for chronic disease management, really key chronic disease prevention, but also just some specifics, things like postmenopausal support and bone health when we think just about our fitness program. So just some basic things that we could change. So what other things can help, or what are some other important steps that we can think about? Well, I would encourage everybody to challenge this idea of age bias, the kind of, you look great for your age, or are you old enough to have the experience to do this job? And just really think about skills instead. We need to recognize the impact of lookism, that women are impacted by this idea of how they look in the workplace and how that can affect their ability to advance their job. There's a lot of women who are in midlife and older who talk about this idea that they're really worried that they're starting to look older and then they're going to be passed over for promotions. A lot of women who don't share the fact that they're going through menopause, because that's one of those things that immediately people can match with age. And so being embarrassed about things like, sweating in the workplace. So again, appearance-based things that are happening. We also want to make sure that we're providing those non-punitive flexible working arrangements, that if those are offered, that there's no strings attached, or that women won't lose out because they're taking flexible work arrangements to increase that work-life reconciliation. I would also really encourage intergenerational collaboration. Just like having a gender diverse team, we know age diverse teams also have higher productivity and do better overall. So this could be everything from mentoring to reverse mentoring. You could have younger employees that are mentoring older folks on, things that might be more of a challenge, things around technology, for instance. And again, that's a generalization. That's not always the case, but this can be something that we can leverage in terms of that intergenerational piece. So just a recap and to think about what is next when I think about the importance of well-being for women at work. I guess I would encourage you to think about, how do you apply these insights to your own workplace? Are there any nuggets in this information that you could take back and apply at work? And I would also say that we're still doing research in this area and we need more of it. So I would encourage you, if you're asked to be part of any of that research, take part, because it's really important for us to understand how workplaces are supporting and changing for women. I would also say that age-friendly workplaces are good for business. We know for all sorts of different reasons. They are important in terms of supporting businesses, but they're just good for business and the bottom line. Good for employees and good for women overall to have a more age-friendly workplace. I also wanted to let you know that I'm going to be putting some additional resources online. We're trying to build a YouTube channel that has all of these fireside chats. If you've been to one of my fireside chats before, you know that I will post the recording, and I do that along with any of the research that I've talked about today. So I'll put that up and you'll get an email from me sharing that recording. So I just encourage you to work together to create a more healthy and supportive environment for women overall, just to keep them in the workplace longer. So thanks so much. Any questions about content? I'm just going to pull up the chat. I apologize. I've had my chat closed here. I'll just pull that up if you just give me 1 sec. And I've put up my contact information. So if you want to get in touch, if you want to have a conversation about any of this content, I'm happy to meet by phone or on a Zoom and clarify anything as well. Let me just pull up the chat. So no questions. Any questions from anybody before I wrap up here today? I'll just give that a minute in the chat. Okay. Well, I hope this was helpful. If you have any suggestions for future webinars, for future topics, I'd love to hear them. And if you're interested in getting a link to that YouTube page with all of the fireside chats, just let me know. And please feel free to reach out if you want any more information.